All right, so here we go. Hey, how's everybody? So we're going to talk about some stuff that happened in U.S. history as we got to the 20th century. And you may or may not have noticed, because I just recently did it, due dates. Oh my goodness. I had some of you email like, can I have some extra time on, look, snowpocalypse, I'll give you some extra time. If you can turn one thing in this week, that would be great. I moved this Friday's due date, the second question, to next Friday, but next week we'll talk about what our firm due dates need to eventually be. It's tricky because I don't really want to push the quiz after spring break because I think you might forget stuff, but we'll talk about that next week. So if this week you can turn in at least one question, that would be cool. Maybe the new nationalism, new freedom question. Also, a couple of you turned those in. Oh, I'm so sorry, that was loud. Over the, I don't want to say break, but snowpocalypse. And if you weren't very happy with your grade, you could redo it if you want. I don't care. It's snowpocalypse, so we'll cut you some slack there. Sorry. And the next chapter, I think it's 20. I've pushed to the March 5th date, but you still have two things due on March 5th. So we'll talk about that next week. Turn stuff in when you're done and I'll grade it. We'll just go with that for right now. But that can't be our consistent policy because I can't have you turn everything in the last week of class. But for now, I understand that, you might be catching up and that your life may have been severely disrupted. I know mine was perhaps slightly disrupted, and I did pioneer things like melt the snow so I could flush the toilets. That was very exciting. And you may have done much more exciting things than that. I joke about that because that was inconvenient, but not terrible. And you may have had something terrible. So I hope not. But let's talk about history for a little while. Okay, maybe that'll make us feel back to normal because, history always cheers us up, right? History is the best. All right, so let's look at the weekly questions. Maybe if I can open them. Weekly question. Okay. All right, weekly question. Compare and contrast new nationalism and new freedom programs. Be sure to mention details of each plan, including who devised the plan and what they include. And question number 5 for chapter 19. Oh, I said 20, didn't I? Sorry. Explain the reasons for and describe U.S. participation in World War I. That could be one of the most confusing. Dang, World War I, that thing made no sense. You know what I'm saying? You had world history. And then your world history said, we don't know why it started. Your teacher said, we don't know why it started. Or they said they killed Franz Ferdinand. And you go like, wasn't that a band? Why did they kill a band? And describe how World War I transformed roles of women, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. The good thing about both these questions is the book will help you. So the book is your friend. Make sure you use the book. That'll be very helpful. All right, let's talk about question number 1 for a minute. Oh, and did you notice that in the announcements, I might have put links to my little summer videos, which I think were pretty focused on at least the new nationalism and new freedom question. You can also see if I look any different in the summer than I do in the winter or whatever season this is, where it snows and then it's 90 and now it's 50. So. But let's talk about this weekly question for a minute or two, and then we'll get into the notes and talk about it probably a little more. I graded a couple of them. Here are concerns that I had. Thing number 1, you got to tell me what new nationalism and new freedom are. I don't mean tell me what's in them, like this one said that there should be free market competition. No, start with telling me what it is. Like, what is new nationalism? Is somebody just walk up today and say, I've got this new nationalism thing in my back pocket? No, you have to say, there was a presidential election, 1912. 2 candidates were Woodrow Wilson. There were more than 2 candidates, but 2 of the candidates, Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, devised the platforms, and their platforms were called New Nationalism and New Freedom. And then you can tell me what's in them. And then you can tell me, how they were like, how they were different. And then It would also be cool if you told me, I like this conclusion kind of stuff. If you would tell me, like, who won, did they enact their program, and was it the way they said it would be? You know what I'm saying? Okay. All right. So, and also here's another thing that some of you are doing, and I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just saying, oh my goodness, you tell me why World War One started. If you want to read a really good book about why War One started, it's kind of old. It's called, and your answer's good, so don't take this the wrong way at all. It's called Guns of August, Guns of Barbara Tuchman, and dang, I I'm not a world historian. I'm not even going to lie. You guys know that. U.S. history, it's my life. Um, World War One was really a war about nothing in a lot of ways, I think. Yeah. Yeah, where everybody sort of picked sides and they didn't necessarily know what the initial conflict, and I don't mean they were ignorant of the initial conflict. They weren't really involved in the initial conflict, but the initial conflict was an excuse for them to perhaps expand their empires or harass a neighbor that they had never really liked, or pick a team and try to win. As a mess. And the Franz Ferdinand dude, even Austria-Hungary didn't like him. So, when he died, they really weren't trying to avenge his death. Okay, I know I'm not really on the subject there, although I kind of am. But it's super complicated and really kind of goes back to the death of Queen Victoria, which was like 20, 30 years before, which left a power vacuum that was trying to be filled by a whole bunch of these leaders of these different European countries, almost all of whom were also relatives, which sort of complicated stuff and also probably complicated things genetically as well. So I've never heard of this valiant hearts thing. Okay, that sounds interesting. Yeah. I guess I didn't have fun World War One teacher, although I may have had, because I'm old enough, may have had a teacher that was actually alive during World War One when I was in, yeah, 8th grade or whenever I studied that. All right, no, it was probably 11th, 10th, and 11th. Okay, back to the weekly question. I apologize. So one thing I am noticing as well is that some of you are using terms that I'm not sure that you understand. So let me see. Sorry, my fingers bother me. What was it that some people used in? I can't remember exactly. For the 1301 class, people kept talking about women embracing Republican motherhood, but then not explaining what Republican motherhood is. I This was something of, oh, I know what it was. You guys were talking about Louis Brandeis and Walter Lippmann, but not telling me who they are. You don't know who Louis Brandeis and Walter Lippmann are? Nobody does, just except Ryan. But nobody knows these people just off the top of their head. So you have to put in parentheses who these people are, okay? So, just a little description like noted jurist or noted economist or something like that. Even a little thing like that will help, okay? Because my impression is you don't know who they are, which is fine. You're not supposed to, but it does mention who they are in the book. So make sure that it's more important than you think. Also, dates on things matter in history classes. So try when you answer these questions to talk about things in chronological order. And if you're not sure, when they happen, just look it up really quick and then put the date in parentheses because it'll help you also see cause and effect and change over time, which are, important historical themes. And some of you are going, yeah, and they also show up on AP exams. They do, but they do for a reason. It's not because people talk about them because they're on AP exams. They're on AP exams because historians talk about them. That also is cause and effect, isn't it? All right, let's go back to the information. All right. Hopefully my weird little rant made a little bit of sense or not. If not, you'll just feel back at home, won't you? All right. Okay, is that big enough? Probably not. Where do I make it bigger? Oh, view. That'll do. I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm struggling with stuff so much today. That didn't help, did it? That's so much better. Sorry. I'm having the same day that I had last week, only there's no reason this time. Okay, here we go. Let's talk about some progressive stuff. One of the things that changes during this time, I hurt my finger, is that people are moving to the city. Okay. Oh, let me talk about this time. I'm just doing the stuff I told you not to do in your answer. So we are now in the progressive era. The progressive era follows, I don't know, Gilded Age. And progressive era is where the government seems to be a little more reflective, people as well. That's why the government is, because, we elect those people. And they look back at stuff from the previous era and they go, what the heck happened? We should try to fix that. So this is the what the heck happened? We should try to fix that era, which ends with World War I. So I don't know how well they did with the what the heck happened? We should try to fix that philosophy, that we end up with World War I in the Roaring 20s. One of the things you'll notice that they really don't care about fixing, racial relations or race relations. You'll notice that. You'll go like, hey, did they forget we have this problem? Yes, they did, or they just were unconcerned. If you're wondering when we try to fix that, we do have times. I mean, you noticed there was a concerted effort during Reconstruction, but it wasn't terrible. It was, you answered the question, partly successful, partly not. And then you'll see it again, little bit post World War I. You'll see kind of the rise of the NAACP, but you'll also see that coupled with the rise of the KKK, round two. And you'll see it again after World War II in a much more successful way, and in a way that probably continues to this day. You should see, if you're paying attention historically, dramatic differences after World War II, and in large part because of World War II and some other stuff, a Supreme Court decision and the NAACP. But all right, but nobody's terribly concerned about race relations during this era except the NAACP. Ida Wells still is, and on a good day, Teddy Roosevelt. And maybe kind of William Howard Taft, but it's not their main thing. All right, let's talk about what the main things were. Remembering that our questions about new nationalism and new freedom, so we'll definitely talk about that as well. All right, so urbanization's a thing, and problems come with urbanization. These are problems that Europeans were already familiar with, overcrowding and sewer system problems, and how do we pay the police, and who do they protect, and all the problems that go along with running a major city. And we've seen that in recent, the last year or so, and then kind of amplified with the snow apocalypse, city services. What happens when those go out, and who is responsible, and how responsible is the city versus the county versus the state when all of those entities rely on each other. This is complicated stuff. And when politicians get involved and they want to make it not so complicated, like it's the other party's fault, or City of Austin says it might be Travis County's fault, Travis County will say it was the state of Texas' fault, Texas will say it was ERCOT's fault. I don't know who ERCOT just resigned, so I don't know. But this is the era where they're going to try to fix some of those problems, maybe professionalize more of the city services and take them out of the hands of politicians. And in some states, they'll want to take those out of the hands of politicians as well. And this will be a discussion that'll be fairly current, I think. I mean, you'll see it more in the modern era as well after the last, week or year, honestly, where people blame each other for stuff and then talk about half the truth. Yep, here we go. All right, so majority people, one big change, majority people living in the city. And rapid urbanization leads to the need for reform. And then you'll start to see people writing a lot more about what's going on in the cities, in part because they want to change it, in part because people are reading the newspaper, so it's getting attention. So not only does it sell the newspaper and you have a job doing this, but also it might actually lead to reform. Initially, national politicians, sometimes state and local politicians, were frustrated with journalists who brought out these problems and said, you're just trying to stir up trouble. And they called them muckrakers. I think well, reputedly, I don't know what the right word is there. Teddy Roosevelt's the fellow who gave them the nickname muckrakers. And muck is just dirty, nasty stuff. And rakers, like raking leaves or something. You guys do that? So a muckraker's stirring up trouble. And they're essentially saying it's fake news. So this call to fake news is not, as new as you might think. But as time went along, people started to notice that this was not, just sensational journalism. This was actually actual reporting, and people would go undercover at meat packing plants like Upton Sinclair, or people would do exposés of the oil industry or the steel industry, or they would go from neighborhood to neighborhood looking at what the housing was like. That's what you see with how the other half how the other I left out other how the other half lives. Shame of the Cities is about the political machines, and certainly we talked about oh crud, what's the name of the political cartoonist? Why did it slip out of my head? Yeah, yeah, I'll think of it in a second. But Lincoln Steffens writes about corruption in political machines. And I think the main subject of his book was actually Cleveland. Um, Lewis Hind was the one who went around taking almost any picture you see of kids at work during that time period without their shoes or in coal mines and stuff. That's probably a Lewis Hind picture. And the most famous of these books is The Jungle. Now, let's say that you want to read The Jungle for your book review. You could. I wouldn't, but you could. I've actually read The Jungle. This is why I say this. It's not a bad book. Well, yeah, it is. It's a terrible book. Sorry, I'm just saying. Have any of you read it? It's a terrible book. Upton Sinclair is an investigative journalist, and he writes a novel to try to convince you that socialism is better than capitalism. I did just say that out loud in Williamson County, and I'm afraid someone could, beat the door down. However, I'm just telling you what Upton Sinclair thought. But he wrote about it in the vehicle of a Central European family that emigrates to Chicago. He calls it Packing Town, and works in these meat packing plants. And he describes all the horrible working conditions, and terrible stuff happens to Jurgis, who's the main character. And it's not a good novel. That's me being really probably no, it's not hypercritical. No one thinks it's a good novel. It's an important novel, but he's not a novelist. So his purpose was to persuade you of something, not to get you to explore your feelings or look at these characters or relate to stuff, which makes, good novels. His purpose was to get you to think socialism was a good idea. What he did for most people is get people to think that inspections in meatpacking plants were a good idea. His descriptions of how disgusting things were in the meatpacking plants are excellent. So that's what people remembered. Now, the last two chapters of the book, this Jurgis, who's lost his whole family and he's injured and stuff, just wanders around edges of Chicago, going to socialist organizing meetings and kind of proclaiming that socialism is great. But I don't think anybody even remembers those chapters, because what ends up in the sausage or how Fred ends up in the lard is much more memorable. So if you read this, it's not a fun book. It's an important book historically, sort of like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is not a good book, but it's an important book. You know what I mean? Okay. All right. There's lots of stuff that you could read that was written during this time period. I had a student read 20 Years at Hull House, Hull House, which was Jane Addams, and that was good. That was good. She liked it, but she also became a social worker, and I mean that was her thing. It wouldn't have been fun, but it talked about what they did at Hull House to help immigrants who were trying to assimilate, I guess is the right word, but how they got help, social services, jobs, that sort of stuff, and the work that they did. So it may be interesting to you. I don't know. And again, on the book review, read something that you think would be interesting. Yeah, that's my suggestion to you. Okay, back to business, although that was part of business. Labor unions, you're going to start to see a little more success for labor unions because it's time to regulate business a little bit. People did decide that getting killed at work should have a consequence for your employer, which is good. Yeah, we don't want people getting killed at work to just happen and people go like, "Yeah, it's Tuesday." So, at this point, worker rights are going to start to expand. Here are things that don't happen. Minimum wage, not yet, and a ban on child labor. They're going to try, not going to be terribly successful. That will become successful in the 30s. And just to be happy and cynical, it's really because there aren't enough jobs for adults. So adults finally say, you know what? I know you can pay my kid less to work, but it's really not healthy for them. That's probably not the main reason they didn't want their kid to work, but who knows? Um, and lots of immigrant families were opposed to ending child labor because they needed the money, because they were kind of underpaid. So whatever little bit helped. And it wasn't, I know sometimes people look at that and go, well, that's really short-sighted and kind of cruel. And it's like, well, yeah, but if you're broke and you need stuff, your life is short-sighted. It's not, where will I be in 10 years? It's more like, will I have enough food for the family this week? So if you're poor, you're short-sighted. You don't really have that many options. I say this as a formerly poor person. All right, but now, living large. Labor. Push to end child labor, and the legislation that's passed during this time period gets overturned by the Supreme Court. So it's not because the Supreme Court thinks kids should work. I don't think that they did. It's because the way the laws were written was to punish people who purchased products created by child labor rather than companies who hired children, which seems unfair. It seems like the kind of a law that Nike would be in favor of. No offense to Nike, or maybe Apple when they were making the iPads. They may still be making them in sweatshops in China. I don't know, but they were laws written to make corporations happy and to look good on the surface, but they weren't legally solid was the issue. So when the Supreme Court overturned them, they weren't really trying to issue a pro-child labor stance. They were saying, Congress, write a reasonable law, which will happen later. Major unions during the era: American Federation of Labor, AFL, which started before, and Industrial Workers of the World. And those guys were seriously communists. They weren't kidding around. They wanted the overthrow of the means of production, and they wanted an international communist workers' revolution. That will gain in popularity until after the Russian Revolution, when it becomes decidedly unpopular in the United States. And we'll have a little Red Scare after World War I, which we'll talk about later. The AFL's fairly conservative. Lets white dudes join. They want better wages, better working conditions, which they refer to as bread and butter issues. And I don't know that bread and butter issues make sense to your generation. I don't know, because you guys don't like carbs as much. But back in the day, and it's really before I was a kid, really my parents' era, in the 50s, the assumption was that with every meal you would have bread and butter. So bread and butter issues are day-to-day, everyday, ordinary. Everybody needs these things, but better wages, better working conditions, better hours. So yeah, back in the day when we had carbs with every meal, membership will triple in the early 1900s, and this will remain mundane, day to day, not unusual. Yes, that's what I was trying to say, and maybe didn't say too well. But thanks, that was good. The membership will triple during this time period, and this will remain a fairly important union. A group of people will, oh dear, oh, homemade bread is good though. That was distracting to me, sorry. The AFL will remain important. A group of them will split off the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and these will be less skilled workers. And then in the modern era, the AFL-CIO is a combined union. Yeah, you're going like, you probably do. If you're a plumber, an electrician, you're probably a member, because that's, yeah. And also, I think firemen and policemen are organized under the AFL-CIO umbrella. There's some teacher groups that are as well. I think I know the American Federation of Labor is the, oh dear, sorry about the bread maker. The which one is it? The American Federation of Teachers, AFT, I think is part of AFL. All right, I'm yeah. In Texas, no unions, so they aren't as big, but trade workers still tend to join them for a variety of reasons. IWW, International Workers of the World, or Industrial Workers of the World. International Communist Socialists, where they want what communists and socialists want. The philosophy is pretty similar between communism and socialism. It really kind of has to do with who runs the show. Socialism, more the government owns the businesses. Communism, more the people own the businesses. Typically, with both philosophies, you end up with, and these are really more economic philosophies, but they turn into political philosophies, and they usually are run by dictators, which is why it doesn't always work out. Okay, never worked out really, with the exception of Macedonia, as we talked about before, with my one student from Macedonia who got really angry with me before he knew me, because I said, evil godless communists. Workers' revolution, socialists want government to have more control. And socialism will become more, I don't know, trendy is the right word, acceptable during this era. It won't be as much in the 20s, and then it comes back in the 30s. There'll be a socialist party that's pretty prominent in the United States. Eugene Debs will run for president 5 times. The socialists will win local and state elections, primarily mayoral elections. And this fellow Upton Sinclair will run as a socialist candidate for governor in California, and he will win. And I know some of you who are more conservative go like, it's still that way. Don't be like that. Don't be like that. Right. Here's some concerns that you can be like that, of course. It's the United States. Be however you like. Concerns that socialists and reformers also had. Some of these people actually were socialists, but both these ladies were. Birth control. That was trendy during the time period. And birth control, sometimes, let me start over. I don't think birth control itself is a very controversial topic. I think most people in the modern era is like, no, I really don't want to have a kid every year. I don't think everyone should have a kid every year. No offense at all if you're a Catholic or Mormon, I get. Okay. But even, I don't know, I got relatives who are Catholic. I got friends who are Mormon. Even they don't always have 12 kids. So birth control, I think in the modern era, people go like, yeah, we don't care. Seems fine. However, if you associate it with abortion, then it becomes much more controversial. That's not really an issue during this era. The reason I point that out is if you are very active in pro-life, pro-choice politics, you have heard of Margaret Sanger. She's the founder of the American Birth Control League, which turns into, I'm going to say it out loud, everybody take a deep breath. Should take a deep breath. Planned Parenthood. It turns into Planned Parenthood. So she's controversial for 100 reasons, but when they started the organization, it's really not about abortion. It's almost abortion surely wasn't legal during this era. And if it happened, it usually ended poorly for the mom as well. So this was not about abortion, even though people tend to associate the eventual organization she started, with that. So, and I'm not going to tell you that Margaret Higgins Sanger is like a really super perfect person. If you do some research on her, you'll find out she's incredibly flawed. And she's going to say some stuff that comes up in the eugenics discussion for the 20s chapter. And you're going to go like, oh, dear Lord, why did she write that down? And I'm going to say the same reason that younger people film themselves, video themselves doing inappropriate things and post it online. I don't know why. She thought it was a good idea at the time. So Sanger wanted information about birth control. In this era, birth control is really, it's condoms. I mean, that's it. And knowing what time of the month you were more likely to produce a child and what time you were less likely to produce a child. So it's really more about information, which was considered pornographic and profane during this time period. So having a public discussion about birth control could get you put in jail, and often did for Margaret Sanger. So she kind of pushed the limits on that to the point where it became acceptable to have those discussions in public. So that was really kind of the main thing. Now it's going to morph into something kind of ugly in the 20s, and we'll talk about that later. Emma Goldman is a socialist and labor activist who also pushes for birth control, and she'll get kicked out of the country more for the socialist labor activist IWW membership thing after World War I. All right, immigration's a thing during this time period because dang, we had a lot of immigrants during this time period because, we're a great place and it's cheap to cross the ocean. And we didn't have as much political turmoil as our friends in Europe. So lots of European immigration, more central and Eastern, as we've talked about before. So labor or immigration rates from 1880, or numbers from 1880 to World War I are about 30 million. And that is a very large percentage of the adult population during that time period. I think I read somewhere a third of all Americans, adults in this era, were not born in the United States. So it's a really big, that could be a bad statistic. So sorry, but a lot of immigrants, a lot of adult Americans were immigrants during this time period. They established more firm immigration policy during this time period. So that's probably a thing you want to pay attention to. You had to check in now when you came to the United States. Ellis Island, East Coast, Angel Island, West Coast. And because of geography, there wasn't a rule, but because of geography, Europeans more at Ellis Island, Asians more at Angel Island. If you wonder where Mexicans checked in, they didn't. They just came across. Because, it's a big border and having check-in spots but there were pretty consistent places where people crossed into the United States, El Paso and the San Gabriel Valley. And that was a weird accent, in California. And most of the folks who immigrated from Mexico probably stayed in the agricultural regions of the California, Texas. There are some agricultural regions in Arizona. It doesn't seem like. I lived there for a while. They'd grow some stuff. Women are going to become a larger part of the workforce, mostly in clerical work, because of adding machines, typewriter, that sort of stuff. A growing number of women sought career advancement and personal independence. Now, if you want to read this book, I don't know how exciting it would be. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Women in Economics. One of the things that she's going to push for, and it doesn't really catch on, but it catches on a little bit in cities, is the idea that women need to be more independent, have more rights, and the only way to do that, have money. Now, you have noticed this. I assume that you guys are young people. That's what I assume. I know you're all younger than me. And you are probably not all to that point where you are financially stable. I've heard from some of you and you're like 15. So I know you're not financially stable and you're not supposed to be. I'm not suggesting. But what you will notice as you get older, when you get more, the way that you get more independence is to be able to pay for your own stuff. Pay for your own stuff. That's how you get independence. Not complete independence, as we found out during snowpocalypse. I can pay my bills, but that doesn't mean I had electricity and water, does it? However, the fact that I can pay my bills means that I don't have to live with my parents in my 50s, which wouldn't that be unpleasant? No, my dad's nice. I'm not complaining about my dad, but I am saying that financial independence equals personal independence. And Charlotte Perkins Gilman was saying, you don't want to be dependent on your family, you don't want to be dependent on your husband, make your own money. So that'll be a thought that is more prominent in cities, of course, because it's also more possible in cities. Not too many women own farms. All right, the big employer during this time period, and your book talks a lot about Fordism. The big employers are corporate during this time period and manufacturing employers. So lots of people worked at factories. And I just thought of the name of that. God, I hate it when this happens. The name of that cartoonist was Thomas Nast, Nast. I know we talked about him before. he's interesting. He's one of the guys that helped reform city governments. But Ford becomes synonymous with these rote jobs. You do the same thing over and over. Some of you are going like, that was like working at HEB last week when I said, no, we're out of that. No, you can only have one of those. It's craziness. Mass production, mass consumption. The thought was during this era, and I don't know if your generation thinks this. My generation did. Your generation's probably grown up with some rough things and maybe not as optimistic as my generation. But we thought, things would always get better, that it would always be easier to purchase more things, the things we wanted, that they would become cheaper and better and that kind of stuff. And I know that's what this generation thought as well, because we read about it. But those generations who feel that way also tend to be a little materialistic. I'm from the 80s, and my goodness, yeah, that was a Wolf of Wall Street kind of generation. Dang, I mean, we thought money was it. That's why I went into teaching, was money. But these guys were pretty sure the more they worked, the more they'd be able to buy. And Ford paid pretty well. He established his own minimum wage, and in many ways was a pretty nice employer. And this idea led to the promise of abundance and prosperity, the thought of the American standard of living. But what we'll notice, and what you notice as you grow up, the difference between what you see and aspire to and what you have is not always, they're not always the same thing. And I don't mean that in a like your life's going to be crap kind of way. I don't mean that at all. I can remember working with somebody who was probably 10 years younger than me. And he, was a history department, so he was a coach. And he said, all I really want is to be able to buy a house it was a country club area. I want to be able to buy a house in this neighborhood and have my wife stay home with the kids. Do you think that's too much to expect? And I went, well, that's more than probably 3/4 of people in the United States and more than about 90% of people in the world. So it might be more than is reasonable to expect. But I think in the United States, and I think in Texas, and if you live in suburban Austin, you look around and you see, this housing explosion. And I know where I live in Leander, they want to build what do they call executive housing. So the houses start at $400,000, $500,000. So all the new houses are fancy, and the people who get elected, usually are in that socioeconomic class. So to them, that's normal. And I mentioned to one of my local politicians, I said, that's more than 2 teachers could afford. That's that house payment. And I don't know, they don't see the world that way. So most people are probably not going to have a $500,000 house and live in Westlake or Steiner Ranch. If you live in Steiner Ranch, no offense at all, or River Place or wherever. Crystal Falls, if you live in Leander, or Treviso, where they apparently didn't have heat or gas. I heard about that. Yeah, no, houses are pricey. They are. My niece sells them. I feel bad for her too, because she can't afford one, but she sells them. Yeah. All right. This is what people were kind of discovering, though, in this era. The promise of prosperity was probably a little exaggerated. Not that they didn't have a better standard of living than possibly where they came from, but it wasn't the wealth that they thought they would have, which led some people to become a little disillusioned. And also the book will mention sometimes the immigrants were referred to as birds of passage, where they would, stay here for a while, but then go back home. And then they would come back, because it was easier to make money in the United States, but it might not, the standard of living might not be what they expect. Yeah. Okay. All right. Coke Zero break. Sorry. So I thought I heard one of my neighbors yelling. There's all kinds of interesting construction going on around here. Well, repair, it's not construction. All right. Progressive thought during this era. Oh, and we're almost to the point where we get to talk about the weekly question. This is exciting. Woo, go team. All right. Progressive thought at work, efficiency through scientific management. So if you were running the show, you wanted your workplace to be efficient. You didn't necessarily want your worker to be happy. You didn't want them to be unhappy. That wasn't your goal, but their happiness was not your main concern. I do think, and some of you are going like, yeah, it's not a concern where I work either. Um, Sometimes you have employers that treat you pretty well. I mean, my impression, I know that working at HEB cannot be a picnic right now. I got friends that work there, and I get it, and relatives and stuff. But I think in general, they treat their workers pretty well. They gave them like pandemic wages, and they seem to have decent insurance, that kind of stuff. So I think HEB in many ways is kind of the ideal working class corporation. And we see that in Texas, and they're generous and donate to folks all the time. And I know you always see those memes like, you want the energy to stay on, let HEB run it. If you want to get a vaccine in a timely fashion, let HEB or Chick-fil-A maybe, run it. So certainly the efficiency part of HEB is nice, but also the we care about our workers part. And I know I will say it's my commercial for ACC. They've been pretty concerned about worker safety and mental health and that kind of stuff, much more so than say when I worked for public school when they really didn't have the luxury of being concerned about that. During this era, their concern really was more, is the workplace efficient? So Ford's concern is safety. I mean, efficiency and safety go together. So that's a plus. At least now the workplace is safe. But their thought is if you do the same thing over and over and over and over, you'll become really good at it, which is probably true, but it's probably really, really dull. And that is one of the things that people complained about in the workplace, that it was really dull. But it was safer, and honestly, they worked fewer hours and got paid more. I know what some of you are thinking. It's like, that sounds ideal to me, a really not hard job where I work fewer hours and get paid more. Maybe, but you would be surprised. No, you wouldn't be surprised because you've been through the pandemic and snow apocalypse. Um, Getting bored sometimes is not good for you. So that was one of the things you see people concerned about. Now, socialists and workers' unions are also saying even though the wages are rising, they still aren't rising as much as, say, the top end of the socioeconomic spectrum. And that's going to be an issue during this era, the difference or the gap between rich and poor. And we still see that as an issue, I think, because it is, because it is. Um, and they saw it as a bigger issue, of course, in the Gilded Age, but part of the goal is to have a discussion about that during this time period. People who own businesses aren't as concerned about that as people who work in the businesses, as a rule. We'll just make HEB the exception to all things, right? Now, the Supreme Court is somewhere in the middle. Like, socialist worker philosophy is that you own a job and the employer doesn't have the right to fire you. There's definitely no court in the United States that agreed with that. So, and that's a really unusual worker philosophy. I don't think very many people in the United States embrace that, and really probably just, I don't know, some people in France somewhere. I don't know, some socialist commune kind of. I mean, it's an unusual philosophy. Supreme Court and the law land somewhere in the middle. So, and the two main court cases during this era, I don't think I asked a multiple choice question about either, though. Miller versus Oregon and Lochner versus New York. Miller, and I mentioned these out of order because I think Lochner is like 1903 and Miller is 1908. But the Lochner case said that the state of New York did not have the right to limit the number of hours that bakers could work in a day because maybe they want to work 20 hours a day, whether it's safe or not, because you're limiting their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, number of hours you want to work, by telling them how many hours they can work and how many they can't. Miller versus Oregon, the 1908 case, said you could limit the number of hours that women could work in a day. And it's really not because they want to protect women necessarily, or because they want to protect workers. It was really about them being women and how their proper place was in the home. Because if they were at work too much, who's taking care of the kids? What if it's dad? You know what happens when dad takes care of the kids? Kids are roaming around in the street. They're eating Cocoa Puffs for breakfast and lunch and dinner, and I know we always got excited when my mom had to work and my dad got to buy dinner because it was, really crappy food that we loved. And my mom would be like, "Where are the Brussels sprouts?" But yeah, my dad didn't like Brussels sprouts, so we were cool with that. So that was kind of what the Supreme Court was thinking. Dad can't take care of the kids. So, and while the Supreme Court may have been right nutritionally, in the modern era, we probably wouldn't see them as right legally. But I think the Miller versus Oregon case is really more, it's not about protecting workers, it's about the place of women in society. And the Supreme Court was pretty sure that place was more important at home than in the workplace. There's some amendments passed during this time period that are often referred to as the progressive amendments. You know what? Maybe I'll have to go back and look at the quiz. Although I put out the list of stuff to study, whatever it says to study on the list is what it is. I bet I did ask a Miller versus Oregon, Lochner versus New York question. I bet I did. These amendments 16 through 19 are referred to as, this is going to be shocking, progressive amendments. Yes, the progressive amendments. Now, 16 is your favorite and mine, although I saw on the news you don't have to pay your taxes until, I don't remember, June maybe. Of course, you guys probably aren't paying, so, file them and get your refund. 16th Amendment creates an income tax. We didn't have one of those before, but we needed more money because the government's doing more stuff during this era. This is the first era where the government thinks it has a role in protecting and caring for the most vulnerable citizens, so they need more money. This was primarily for wealthy people. Very few people actually paid income tax during this era. I think it was about, I know it was less than 10%, and I think it was about 5%. Because the first time a majority of people pay income tax is during World War II, because everybody's working 2 jobs. So they're finally earning enough money. And then in the modern era, I think, well, it's well over 50%, I think now. Yeah. And I don't mean like if you get a refund, you're still paying some taxes. You know what I mean? You just get some of it back. 17th Amendment provides for direct election of senators. You have an election. If you want to, like, how did we get them before? Did we just like lottery? No. The governor picked them or the state legislature picked them. So the thought here is that people will vote more often and get more involved in politics if they can directly elect their senate. 18th Amendment, your favorite and mine, prohibition makes alcohol illegal. You can't sell it, can't produce it, can't distribute it. So therefore you also should not be drinking. So no drinking. And I know that's perfect for you guys because probably a lot of you are under 21. You don't drink anyway. And I'm an old person, but I don't drink very often. So we could bring back the 18th Amendment and I'd be okay with it. Probably I'm in the minority there. I wouldn't want to enforce it though. I just no. Enforcing it creates a mess and the mafia. So yeah, it's kind of problematic. We'll talk about it later. And the 19th Amendment, possibly the most important amendment to the Constitution. Women get to vote. This always makes somebody mad when I say that. They go like, "Don't you think the First Amendment's more important?" It's like, okay, yeah, but I'm just saying it's good that women got to vote. That's all I'm saying. All I'm saying. I don't know which amendment's most important. But the 19th, it matters quite a bit. All right, big yawn. Sorry. So sorry. Government by expert replaces government by politician. And this is an interesting thing. I think the city of Austin, sorry, squirrels on the back porch. I think the city of Austin is actually trying to reverse this, where the city council and the mayor have more control than the city manager. And most cities in the modern era, after this era, will go to this city manager idea where the hired expert has more control over the day-to-day operations than the elected officials. And the problem, crud, I'm not in charge of any of this stuff. And, we see issues in larger cities, Austin. I know New York City, of course, is having, lots of discussions about this. And we're seeing, difficulty with appointed versus elected positions in things like the electrical or is it Electrical Reliability Council? Yeah, ERCOT. So, I mean, we still struggle with this. I know the Commissioner of Education in Texas is appointed and not elected. We elect judges but don't appoint them. So I don't know. All this stuff's a little tricky, but the thought during this era was that professionals who are trained are also less likely to be corrupt and influenced by, wealthy people, that sort of thing. And I think that's true sometimes. Sometimes it's not. But city managers make the day-to-day decisions, and typically mayors are not paid. I know, like Leander and Cedar Park. I think it's the same in Round Rock. They aren't paid. I don't know if in Austin that they are. They might be. My dad lives near Cleveland. The mayor and city council are paid there. When you're paid, I mean, the assumption is you make more of the day-to-day decisions. But if you're a volunteer, they work their day jobs. So having them make the day-to-day decisions may not be the best plan. But city managers and instead of mayors making day-to-day decisions in local government, and the thought is that they would be college educated. There's also a bigger push for like social workers and government workers to have more formal education. Also a push for healthy mothers and children as a foundation for more educated American society. So you're going to see health insurance for moms and kids. I know you're going like, dads are out of luck. Yes, dads are out of luck during this time period. It is true. But moms and kids are seen as more vulnerable. So fair, not fair, just what it is. And regulation and licensing of professions like law. In some states you could also just say you were a doctor and therefore you were. So now most states have a exam that you have to pass and a fairly rigorous system of education, a degree plan for law, engineering, medicine, social work, and teaching. Yeah. Can you believe it? I went to college. Amazing. All right. During this era, the presidents that we elect are progressive presidents. Now, two are Republicans. One is a Democrat. If you have friends who like politics, they probably know about 2 out of 3 of these presidents: Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Often people like Woodrow Wilson because he creates sorry, I'm going to sneeze at you, League of Nations, which is like the predecessor to the United Nations. Excuse me. And sometimes Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt because he's interesting. Sometimes they go like, he wasn't even a real conservative. He's a progressive Republican. So everyone in this era is progressive. So their philosophy and their actions are pretty similar, and their policies are pretty similar. I know that's not your answer to the weekly question. You'll go like, no, their policies weren't the same. Okay, they weren't, but how they carried them out, yeah. I mean, I know what Wilson said, but I also know what Wilson did because I'm the history teacher, not because I was there. Teddy Roosevelt replaces McKinley after he's assassinated by Leon Czolgosz, who's an anarchist. Yeah, they cause trouble, don't they? So McKinley gets assassinated. Teddy Roosevelt was vice president so he could draw some urban votes, New York votes. The party really didn't want him to be in charge of stuff because he'd be hard to control because he's Teddy Roosevelt. And they were correct. He was hard to control. He wanted to reform stuff. And that was not what the Republican Party, the Democrats weren't either. I'm not, trying to diss Republicans. But this is not what the Republican Party was about during this era. It becomes what the Republican Party is about. Now, I know we talked about it before. The Republican Party was the one that really wanted sort of equality after Reconstruction. They're the party of Lincoln. So I know that at times they are the reform-minded party. I know that. So I'm not saying. But Roosevelt was the first president to intervene in a strike on behalf of workers. He told coal companies that they needed to negotiate with their workers and that they could use the White House to do it and that he would, help them negotiate. And they said, no, thanks. And he said, I believe you misunderstood. You will either come to the White House and negotiate, or I will nationalize the coal mines and the troops will be there tomorrow. So they said, what time would you like us there? So it ends up helping the workers, and he thought that the government should be the most fair arbitrator or arbiter, referee, negotiator between businesses and workers. And he's a little quirky in some of his beliefs because by quirky, I mean inconsistent. That's probably a better word. Because he thought good monopolies should stay together, but bad monopolies should not. And if you're wondering what's a good monopoly, it's whatever Teddy Roosevelt thought was a good monopoly. So it could be, what could it be? Standard Oil, but not he didn't like the Northern Securities Company. He did like Standard Oil. There are a couple others that'll get broken up that will upset him. But yeah, so Teddy Roosevelt inconsistent about that, but he's going to break up a lot of monopolies, more than anyone else until William Howard Taft. So he's sometimes referred to as the trust buster, and certainly going to make a more active government in controlling things like what goes into your food. After he read The Jungle, it's like, yeah, let's pass some stuff. So Pure Food and Drug Act, Meat Inspection Act, and Interstate Commerce Act creates the Interstate Commerce Commission to make sure that commerce and railroads and telephone and telegraph are, run more fairly as well. All right. William Howard Taft, Teddy Roosevelt said, you know what, 7 years as president, enough for me. I want to go off and do my thing, which for him was safari and hunting and exploring and finding the Rio Roosevelt and doing whatever he did, getting malaria and nearly dying because, you know, you got to go do stuff. Plus, he was young. He's the youngest president we ever had. I know what one of you is saying. No, that was Kennedy. No, you're wrong. Roosevelt was a year younger. But the reason we don't count Roosevelt is he's the youngest ever to become president, and Kennedy's the youngest ever to be elected. Because Roosevelt wasn't elected in the first time, you see? Yeah, I'm helping you for Jeopardy later on. But Taft was Roosevelt's assistant secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt said, you know what, Taft, I think you'd be a great president. And Taft went, oh, great. He didn't want to be president, but he's president. I don't know if that ever happens to people. I know what a couple of you are saying too. You're going like Joe Biden. No, Joe Biden wanted to be president. He's wanted to be president probably since I was born. Probably because he's been in politics like 50 years. So maybe a few years after I was born. But anyway, Taft wanted to be Supreme Court justice because his background was in the law. But Roosevelt asked him to run for president. His wife apparently wanted to be first lady. It's a story I read. I like to retell it. I'm sure it's true. Who knows? But Taft became president, and Roosevelt said he will be an excellent president. Young Joe Biden. He was young at some point. Taft is not Roosevelt. I think this is a problem when you follow, you know, somebody who was maybe a mentor of yours or an associate of yours who was really, really good at stuff. Like, this may not be a fair comparison, and I'm not trying to upset you, but let's say Biden and Obama. Obama's more fun. I mean, Biden's more likely to say exciting stuff, but Obama's more fun. He's younger, he's more interesting. He's a little more hip. He's less like, can I say hip? Yeah, he's more in tune to popular culture. Yeah. Better with technology, more energetic. And Biden's it's like your grandpa is president. But, you know, Biden is your grandpa as president. So maybe you're ready for your grandpa, but he's not as fun or interesting. Taft followed Roosevelt, who was like, Roosevelt had the heavyweight champion boxer over to the White House and boxed with him. Sometimes if Roosevelt wanted, like a newspaper reporter wanted to give him an interview, Roosevelt would take off running. And if you could keep up with him, you got the interview. And Roosevelt loved to give speeches. He was a very public person. He wanted to be with the public all the time. Taft was not that way. Taft is like, let me sit in my work or at my desk and work. I don't want to have press conferences. I don't want to give speeches. I don't want to hug people. I don't want to kiss babies pre-pandemic. Don't get upset. I just want to do my job. So that's kind of, Taft was pretty workmanlike. Now, also Taft kind of gets a bad rap. Most people who know anything about Taft, what they know about Taft is probably not true. There's a story about him getting stuck in a bathtub in the White House. So they replaced the White House bathtub. They were apparently, I read about this too. the press didn't like Taft because he didn't like giving press conferences. So they found out he was they were replacing the bathtub. So one of the reporters apparently made up a story about him getting stuck in the bathtub. And it's about the only thing anyone knows about Taft, and it's not true. But Taft broke up more monopolies, put more land into preservation. I forgot to say that about Roosevelt because he's known as a conservationist president as well. And Taft is even more so, but Taft's reputation is not nearly as strong. He serves one term. He does end up having the very public disagreement with Teddy Roosevelt over breaking up Standard Oil and over allowing some federal lands to have oil harvested. And he and some of his former appointees disagreed with that in a very public way that led to one of these fellows getting fired. I think it was Pinchot. Ballinger was Secretary of the Interior and Pinchot was the head of the National Forestry Service. So Pinchot disagreed with Ballinger very publicly. Ballinger said, hey, cut that out or I'm going to have to fire you. Pinchot said, I will not. And then he got fired. And then Teddy Roosevelt went, that's it. I'm going to run for president in 1912. Which leads us to almost the weekly question. We're so close, aren't we? Yeah, okay. All right. In the 1912 election, you have 4 candidates. That makes it complicated. Now, I know what some of you are saying. I'm reading minds a lot today, aren't I? Some of you are saying every year, every presidential election, we have like 8 candidates. That's true, but one of them is like Green Party, and one of them is the whatever party likes marijuana. I forget what that party is. And there's usually a socialist guy running, and there's a libertarian. But a lot of them are people that'll get votes from their relatives and maybe 5 other people. These are all viable candidates that got a large number of votes, at least 1 million. So you have Taft, who's the incumbent. Incumbent would be, one of you is going to tell me the name of the party that, okay, Kanye West. Okay, there you go. yeah, these were not, no offense to Kanye, but these were not the Kanye West kind of candidates. You had Taft, who was the incumbent or current president. You had Roosevelt, former president, and he runs as a third-party candidate under the Progressive Party or Bull Moose Party, a nickname given because Teddy Roosevelt's given a speech during his campaign. The crazy dude comes up and shoots him. He falls down, gets back up, coughs into his hand. There's no blood. He goes, I must be fine. Finishes the speech. Afterwards, reporters say, like, how are you, sir? And he goes, I feel as strong as a bull moose. So Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt got shot where he had this speech folded up because he memorized the speech, put it in his pocket, and his glasses were there as well. So apparently all that deflected the bullet. So bonus for him, right? So Roosevelt, tough dude. And the Democrat, I didn't mention the socialist, did I? Well, that was just rude, wasn't it? It's the same guy as always, Eugene Debs and Woodrow Wilson. So the Democrats said, you know what, let's grab kind of a clean, shiny, clean it up kind of guy. And Wilson was their dude. He had only been in politics for 2 years. He was the governor of New Jersey and had been president of Princeton before that. And before that, he was a professor at Princeton. And before that, he was a football coach at Princeton. And before that, he was a lawyer for like 2 years. And before that, he was a student at Princeton. Princeton was kind of his home away from home. There we go. Maybe natural law is the let's have marijuana party. I know libertarians don't care either, but it's not their main thing. Yeah. All right. Back to our business here. Okay. So this is our quick version of stuff to talk about for your weekly question. You have to mention in the weekly question that these guys are, that New Nationalism and New Freedom are platforms that they are proposing. A platform is what you'll do if you get elected to be president. So it's your list of presidential promises. So please mention that when you don't just start off with New Freedom was this, New Nationalism was this. They were alike, they were different. Don't, you got to do a little more. Explain to me what they are, why they're even talking about this stuff. So you got to start with the election. And I would love it if you told me who won. That would be useful. I'm just saying. And about how Wilson's New Freedom maybe isn't exactly, you don't have to go into a lot of detail, but you'll notice at the end of the chapter, it mentions that when Wilson gets elected, his government looks a lot more like what Roosevelt promised. It does. Okay. All right. Taft's platform is, you know me, you know what I'll do. He didn't really have a platform. He goes, yeah, I'll just be me. You've already seen me. Um, and this, what is the word I'm looking for? The traditional Republicans probably favored Taft because he was predictable, and they thought maybe they would have more control over him than Roosevelt. Roosevelt attracted, some young voters and some reformist Republicans. Even though I know I just said Taft did a lot of reform stuff, he just did it in a not very flashy way. I know that sounds weird, but it seemed to matter. So Roosevelt's platform is new nationalism. He wanted a larger, more active federal government to regulate the economy, protect workers, women, children in a fair way. He wanted what he called a continuation of the square deal. Not necessarily that the government would favor business or would favor workers, but they would do what was best for everyone. And he wanted to grow the size of the federal government so they would do a better job intervening, regulating, um, protecting and preventing monopoly, that sort of thing. Wilson was really more of a free market guy, and said, at least said, that his program would be called New Freedom, where the federal government doesn't grow in size. They might become more efficient. That kind of fits with progressive theory of the time, but that more of the reform would occur at the state level, And he's favored more by, reform-minded law scholar Louis Brandeis, Wilson will point to the Supreme Court later on. And he's the one who helped write the Brandeis brief, which he successfully argued Miller versus Oregon. So he's a pretty famous lawyer. So mention that if you talk about Louis Brandeis, that, he's a pretty famous lawyer, legal scholar, something. But the idea that law and courts should be reform minded as well. And people might think of that as activists rather than conservative jurist, an activist jurist rather than conservative jurist. Excuse me. But Wilson really thought that reform should be handled more at the state level, and the government should act more like a referee. The size of the government shouldn't grow, and that maybe more of the reform, like in the Illinois model or the Wisconsin model, should happen at the state level. One of the things you should also probably be aware of, and we'll talk about this more next time because I know it's almost time to go. Wilson's from Georgia, and I'm sure we love people from Georgia, and some of you might be from Georgia, so I'm not saying anything bad, but there were some Southern things about him. And I'm not talking like, grits and biscuits and gravy, because he's a Princeton dude, but his parents had they had run a Confederate hospital during the Civil War. And he's going to write a history of the United States that will be quoted in this incredibly racist movie called Birth of a Nation that they'll screen at the White House. Taft and Roosevelt before him, and then Taft, desegregated the federal workplace. So if you worked for the federal government, blacks and whites worked in the same offices. You might sit next to each other at your desks and that sort of thing. Wilson brings back segregation to the federal workplace. And the states' rights feeling that Wilson has, that you may look at and you go like, that feels a little like states' rights. There's probably a reason it feels a little like states' rights. When you look at Wilson, he's progressive about a lot of things. Race is not one of them. And race is a really big flaw. I don't even know that flaw is the right word, but it's a consistent problem for Wilson. You'll see that if you study him more. I remember when I was teaching, the high school class, I had a colleague, golf coach. Thank you for the 4-minute warning. The golf coach also taught U.S. history and taught it forever because, he just wanted to teach one thing. And he was old enough, he'd lived through some of it. And we were talking one day, he goes, I really like Wilson. I think he was probably the best president we've ever had. He really tried to modernize foreign policy and, he wrote the Treaty of Versailles. And I went, that whole race thing was sort of a problem for him. And he goes, there was a race thing? I went, oh my goodness. Okay. There's a race thing for Wilson. It's an issue for sure. And I think in the modern era, because we're definitely more sensitive to that in the modern era. And I get it's not the only thing, but it's a thing. Yeah. And Wilson is part of the reason progressivism kind of regresses about issues of race over time. You start to see some progress with Roosevelt and Taft, and then Wilson will definitely reverse it. So, and I don't mean that, I know it's always complicated to talk about historical people, but I don't mean to say that Wilson doesn't deserve some sort of recognition for things that he did, but we have to look at the whole of what Wilson did. Wilson will do some stuff that's pretty useful, and then some of the stuff you look at and you go like, no, that was not good. And that's true of any president. It really is. We haven't had a perfect one. Yeah, maybe. I'm not suggesting that Biden will be, and no one will be. All right, so I got the 4-minute warning, which is probably now down to 3. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm hoping that you have enough stuff to at least complete the chapter 17 question. So maybe work on that, do your best on that, try to get that done. I have a work conference that starts actually tonight, work related. It's a teacher group conference. Thursday night, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I get back home, plus soccer starts next week. So if I look at your stuff, it'll probably be on Monday, or if the conference, I need a break from the conference, I'll come grade your papers. Yeah, I don't know, we'll see. So I may be a little slow on grading is what I'm saying. So yeah, if you can do that question by tomorrow, that would be great. Also on this one, I'm going to understand if you're a little late. I am. I was without power briefly, but mostly without water, and your life was in turmoil. Mine was as well. So, the downed tree limbs and melting the snow and being a pioneer for a week, it's exhausting. So, if I were you, I'd try really hard to get it done, because, putting stuff off just means you have more stuff to do later. So at the very least, try to do 17. I've changed the due date for 18 until next week. And then on Tuesday, we'll rediscuss what we want to do as far as firm due dates for.
Wait. It's 18 and 19, right? Because 17 is the Philippine War one.
Oh, sorry, 18 and 19. Sorry.
Okay.
So whatever was due today is, no, wait a second. Hang on. Let me look at the notes again. I don't want to get it wrong, because I already did. Are you sure it's because 18's due, isn't 18 the
18 is progressive era.
yeah, I thought 18 was due today or tomorrow, excuse me.
Yeah, 18 is due tomorrow, but we did 17 last time already.
I thought you already turned in 17. What was 17?
Yeah, we did.
Okay, so, all right, then you're making me confused. I'm blaming you. Is that okay? So
What?
yeah, I'm blaming you. Yeah, it's your
Some
fault.
people not turning 17 or what?
It's whatever it says on Blackboard. Dang it. Now you're confused.
Yeah, then it's 18, because like 17 is the week before the break, so.
Right. I think you already took the quiz and stuff. Now, if you didn't turn in 17, just turn it in, okay? But 18 and 19, I think were technically, like, for a while, they were both due tomorrow, but I moved 19 to where it's due next week. So if you look, I promise you, if you look at the due dates in Blackboard, I changed those. Try to turn in one thing, 18 this week for sure, okay? All right. So 18 for sure this week. Not if you can. Now, if your life has been trauma, I'm not going to be upset that you turn in stuff a little bit later. But 19 is list. Thank you. Aaron's saving the day here. So 18, try very hard by Friday. 19, I moved the date to next Friday. And then on Tuesday, we're going to revisit all the due dates. Okay. So try to get 18 done. That's what I'm saying. Okay. All right. I know. Oh, dang it. We're still recording. I'm going to stop.